had tiny samples of their liver taken. Looking back through these biopsies, she suspected that some patients' livers were showing signs of progressive damage. She asked a pathologist specialising in the liver, Dr. Ross Cameron, to show the biopsies to a panel of experts.
This is amongst the very quickest type of progression going on here. In other situations, in viruses or alcohol, it takes a number of years to progress at that rate. So it was a little bit alarming at that time.
Ignoring further legal threats from Apotex, Dr. Olivieri told her remaining patients on L1 that she felt the drug may not be safe and advised them to go back to the nightly needles.
It was a terrible sentence to think that you have to go back on needles. And, you know, a lot of patients opted to keep on until they had no drug left.
But it wasn't only the patients who were suffering. Dr. Olivieri was also showing signs of strain after continuing threats from Apotex to sue her.
I was writing this editorial bringing attention to these strong-arm tactics on the part of drug companies when they didn't like the results of good trials. So I phoned Nancy Olivieri, and she wouldn't speak with me, and nor would her lawyer. Since we've become good friends, we have a lot of interchange, but at that time she was extremely frightened, extremely intimidated, was scared stiff that she would be ruined, fired, just have her professional life destroyed.
After almost a year of legal threats, Dr. Olivieri finally confided in a senior colleague.
Frankly, I didn't believe her, and I think she had guessed that. And very shortly after we had this discussion, she returned to my office with a pile of paper about that high and dumped it on my desk and said, there's your homework. And indeed, I spent the next couple of weeks reviewing the pages and trying to sort of put the pieces together myself. And it became very obvious to me that everything she told me was true. And I honestly couldn't believe it even then. At least I did believe it, but it seemed unbelievable.
With the support of Dr. Jury and a handful of other colleagues, Dr. Olivieri lobbied the university for support in her battle with Apotex. What they didn't know was that at the time the then president was negotiating a multi-million-dollar donation from Apotex to fund a new building.
Who's pulling the strings? Because money tends to come with strings. That's the problem. We know very well that in Toronto, the president of the university was made to apologize for the lobbying he did on the part of Apotex when $20 million was dangled in front of him. And if you've got tons and tons and tons of cash, lo and behold, how do you use it? You use it to smooth the way, to get your product out there, to influence people, to influence institutions, research institutions, and specific scientists.
And as pressure mounted on Dr. Olivieri, those offering her support also found themselves in the firing line.
There was this extraordinary letter. And my first look at it, because there was lots of spelling errors and typographical errors in it, that I thought it was a joke. And I suddenly realized that this was a very threatening letter. And I had this sort of eerie sense that there was somebody out there that was trying to get me. And a lot of thoughts went through my mind. I immediately became concerned about my personal safety. I became concerned about my family's safety.
The campaign of poison pen letters to Dr. Jury lasted several months, but the sender made a crucial mistake. By licking the envelope seal, he was leaving telltale DNA evidence. Evidence which a team of highly qualified scientists were in an ideal position to gather. From the spelling and grammar mistakes in the letter, they suspected a colleague, the man who first involved Apotex in the trials, and who was still receiving substantial research funding from the company, the Associate Director of Research, Dr. Gideon Corran. He strenuously denied the allegation, but by finding a letter sent and signed by Corran, they were able to analyse the DNA and compare it with the DNA on the poison pen letters. It was a perfect match, and after months of denial, Dr. Corran finally admitted sending the hate mail.
It horrifies me that an individual in a position of trust, who is not only caring for children, who is in a position of leadership and power within one of the largest pediatric institutions in the world, would lie and lie and lie continuously in order to, and deny, basically, when being confronted about the obvious. Yes. I can't imagine a worse situation.
During this time, Dr. Olivieri was called to one of the meeting rooms in the hospital, where her worst fears were realised.
The decision had been made for me to be dismissed from the program for the 10 or 12 bad things that I had allegedly done. I can't say that I was completely shocked, because this was the kind of thing that was escalating all the time, and 4 or 5 letters, private and confidential, about complaints that were never established were delivered to my door on a daily basis. But by this time, I guess they decided, okay, this is it. We got up and left and went next door. It was next door to my office at the time, and basically stared at each other and realized, I'm fired.
The hospital was removing Dr. Olivieri because of concerns about her wider performance as director of the thalassemia program. Almost immediately, Professor Weatherall and a colleague from Harvard, David Nathan, flew to Toronto.
David and I were terribly worried that this excellent program would fall apart if Dr. Olivieri were to leave or to be thrown out of Toronto, because there were just not obvious people of her ability to take her place. So that was our major reason for going. And secondly, we did feel that this principle of academic freedom and the freedom of scientists to disseminate their results was also a major issue.
Their intervention was eventually successful, and she was reinstated with a letter agreeing to a fresh start. With Dr. Olivieri back, Apotex decided to move the battle to get L1 approved to a new venue, far from troubled Toronto. In 1999, Europe became the first territory to license L1 under the brand name Feriprox.
There are many, many children in Europe right now who, because of that licensing, are taking what I believe is a drug that is neither adequately effective or safe. And whether I'm right, whether I'm wrong, that's not the issue. The issue really is that it's not been determined. The jury's still out on whether the drug's effective and safe, and we still need to know that, and that is not the time to license a drug.
So what have you done about the licensing of the drug?
We've taken the European Commission to court over what I believe is the premature licensing of a drug without adequate demonstration of its safety and effectiveness.
Apotex are adamant their drug is safe and effective, and point out it's now been licensed in 24 countries. They say that many studies contradict Olivieri's findings, and they're contesting the case vigorously. In court, Apotex have produced a list of over 3,000 alleged protocol violations, errors they say Dr. Olivieri committed during her drug trial, which make the results worthless. For the last 6 months, Dr. Olivieri has been tied up double-checking the alleged errors.
Next patient.
Next patient had alleged protocol violations 4, number of true protocol violations 0.
An independent expert has gone over the research and found the allegations to be almost entirely baseless. The European Court heard the arguments 2 weeks ago and must now decide whether to accept Apotex's evidence that their drug is safe and effective, or to believe Dr. Olivieri and order that the license for L1 should be reviewed.
Oh, that's where you had your needle today. Does that itch or anything?
Her patients are now back on the nightly needles. But as Dr. Olivieri's battle with Apotex continues, she's learnt of a growing number of doctors claiming unacceptable pressure from other leading drug companies.
You know what I see back there?
Lion King.
No, I'm just kidding.
Do you think your experience is unusual?
No, I no longer think that. I thought that it was at the beginning. And then I got possibly hundreds of letters from people who had been in similar situations, but they had been permanently fired, or they'd lost a whole program of medicine, for example, and had to move to another state or another country. They had been followed by private investigators into every single aspect of their personal and professional lives. They had been destroyed in a way that I don't think any of us have been, at least yet.
Most people say, why should I spend all this time fighting? So we don't hear about it. It just never really comes above the radar. There are many, many cases like that. She had a choice, and she took the really courageous one. And she fought, and with luck will all benefit as a consequence. But what a huge hole she's left in the field by taking herself out and not doing any research worth anything very much during those years. It's tremendously sad, and I think her life must be seen at this moment as a tragedy. She's triumphed in every court there's been, but it's not done yet.
The editors of a number of the most important general medical journals, particularly the Lancet and the Journal of the American Medical Association, have stated recently that they've had pressures put on them not to publish or to change data. And I think this kind of thing may become commoner in the future. What's worrying me is that nobody seems to want to discuss these issues. The university don't want to discuss them, government don't want to. I think there's so much money involved, and particularly with the universities being bankrupt and looking upon this as such a valuable source, they don't want to rock the boat. But the boat really does need rocking.
Half a world away from Toronto, South Korean patients suffering from leukemia are trying desperately to rock Big Pharma's boat. They risked their lives to bring a new drug to market and are now furious that the very same drug is being priced beyond their means.
돈 있는 사람들은 약을 먹고 생존할 수 있겠지만 없는 사람들은 실제로 다 죽거나 이렇게 되게 되면
South Korea has become the stage for the latest battle between patients and a big pharma company over the price of life-saving drugs. The Swiss firm Novartis has been testing a new drug for myeloid leukemia. The trials have gone well, and the new drug, Glivec, has been approved in record time. For patients whose lives have been devastated by this form of leukemia, Glivec is a genuine lifesaver. But far from thanking Novartis, they are angrily protesting outside the company's Korean headquarters.
지금은 매일매일 순간순간 죽음이라는 그림자가 항시 따라다녀요. 이 약을 먹기 전에는 더 심했고 먹으면서도. 제발 좀 약 효과가 잘 나타나서 좀 벗어났으면 그 그림자에서.
Jung will keep on demonstrating until Novartis agrees to drop their price for Glivec. For him, it's a matter of life and death. He cannot afford the one drug that might keep him alive.
처음에는 만성 피로 증후군처럼 되게 피곤하고 자꾸 졸립고 그랬었어요. 처음에는 CM이라는 병이 어떤 병인지 잘 몰랐습니다. 그래서 처음에는 뭐 크게 당황하거나 그렇지 않았는데 치료를 받으면서 주위 분들이 한두 번씩 이렇게 사망을 하면서부터 심하게 우울해지고 많이 괴로웠죠. 그전에는 처음에는 잘 몰랐었어요.
Desperate to stay alive, he turned to the internet for information on myeloid leukemia.
연창계 매스컴에서 글리벡이라는 어떤 신약이 지금 이제 외국에서 많은 임상을 하고 있고 완치율이 상당히 높을 거다.
Jung made sure he was amongst the first patients on the trial.
글리벡 먹는 당시에는 이제 가속해서 급성기로 넘어가는 그런 식으로 이제 판명이 났었는데 글리벡 한 3개월 이상 복용하면서 만성기로 다시 돌아왔어요. 그 다음에 다시 한 3개월 정도 먹으면서 다시 이제 골수 검사에서 검사 현상에 먹기 전에는 뭐 한 약을 안 먹었을 경우에는 한 6개월 정도 시한부 이렇게 봤을 정도로 병세가 좀 안 좋았었거든요. 근데 지금 약 복용한 지 지금 한 14개월 정도 되는데 지금까지는 뭐 잘 견디고 있는 것 같아요.
The results meant Novartis were able to get their new drug approved in record time. Now free to market the drug, they had to decide how much they would ask for the tablets, which until now Jung had been given for free.
If you look at products like Glivec for leukemia, if you don't get the drug, the consequences are pretty bad. I mean, the products are priced according to what it's worth to someone to get access to the drug. It saves your life, it's worth quite a bit. I mean, it's certainly worth everything you have. What the companies want to do is they want to say, this is how much a human life is worth, and this is what our company wants to keep that life alive.
Novartis decided that the price of life in Korea would be up to $55,000 a year, $19 a tablet, 8 tablets a day, indefinitely. Even with the government paying most of these costs, many Korean patients say they cannot afford Glivec.
없는 사람들은 실제로 다 죽거나 이렇게 되게 되면 그런 부분들은 미연에 방지해야 되지 않느냐 그런 거죠. 기존에 살고 있던 좀 큰 집에서 병원비라든가 약값 이런 것들을 마련하기 위해서 줄이고 이렇게 왔거든요. 다른 병원비도 들어가고 생활비도 들어가고 이러니까.
Pharmaceuticals, they're a commodity, but they're not just a commodity. There's an ethical side to this, because they're a commodity that you may be forced to take to save your life. And that gives them an altogether deeper significance. But they have to realize that they're not just pushing pills. They're pushing life or death. And I believe that they don't always remember that. Indeed, I believe that they often forget it completely.
Big Pharma generally defends high prices for new drugs by saying that they have to cover the costs of researching and developing drugs. But in fact, most new drugs launched are just slight variations of existing medicines, so-called Me Toos.
At the moment, we're getting more and more drugs of less and less use. Me Too drugs, the 10th headache pill, the 15th Viagra. There are currently 8 drugs in development at the moment for erectile dysfunction. Do we need 8 more drugs for erectile dysfunction? I don't think we do. Meanwhile, diseases like malaria, tuberculosis that kill 6 million people every year are neglected. No new medicines are coming out, and we're left treating people with old drugs that increasingly don't work.
The market in developing countries, where the majority of the market is there for tuberculosis, malaria, some of the tropical diseases, it's a market in terms of numbers of people, but the purchasing power isn't there. And if the purchasing power isn't there, then the normal dynamics of the research and development industry just don't address those problems.
Glivec is an innovative new drug for a deadly disease. But even in this case, Jamie Love believes that claims about the cost of development don't justify the price tag.
A lot of the important development work was paid for by the U.S. government in that product. It was also a product that was approved very quickly. It was on the market a couple years after the patent was filed. So they had short trials, they had small trials, and they had short development period. And that made Glivec a relatively inexpensive product to bring to market.
Under world trade rules, the patent Novartis hold on Glivec gives them exclusive rights to make the drug for 20 years. So the price, in common with most patented drugs, is mainly set by the drug company, leaving governments or patients very little room to negotiate. Unless, that is, the government threatens to overturn the patent with a so-called compulsory license.
There are mechanisms within the World Trade Organization agreements, something called compulsory licensing, which is basically authorizing a producer other than the patent holder to produce the product. The patent holder gets a what's called an economic return. They do get some royalty. It's not a theft of patent. It's a very orderly process.
Compulsory licensing, or even the very threat of compulsory licensing, is a very effective tool to bring the price of branded medicines down. I understand that the price of Glivec worldwide is between $20 and $25 per tablet, but the Brazilian government have been offered those tablets for $8 a pop. And the Brazilian government has an enormous generic pharmaceutical capacity. You can very well imagine that when Novartis were negotiating with the Brazilian government, the threat of Brazil not getting a good enough price and making the generic drugs themselves was very, very real and forced Novartis into a position of offering a highly preferential price to that country.
The leukemia patients turned to one of Korea's top patent lawyers, Hee-Sob Nam, for guidance. Mr. Nam delivered a compulsory license application to the Korean authorities in July 2001. It brought a swift response. From Washington, a letter from the US Secretary of Trade warning Korea's Minister of Health not to meddle with the price of drugs.
We are concerned about the discriminatory effect the proposed changes would have upon our products. If not addressed appropriately, this issue is likely to develop into a serious trade dispute.
Ignoring these warnings, the Korean Minister of Health campaigned for lower drug prices. Then he was sacked in a cabinet reshuffle. He immediately and angrily spoke out about what he believed was behind the sacking.
제약회사들이 저희 법원 복지부를 호되게 흔들고 또 뒤흔드는 각종의 활동이 진행되고 있다는 것도 잘 알고 있습니다. 이번 교체의 이유에 대해서는 또 설명도 듣지 약선의 강력한 반발과 저항이 매우 거셌다고 생각합니다.
How is it that companies can terrify the government of an Asian country so they won't import cheap medicines? It's because they not only can threaten not to make medicines available, but they can credibly threaten that the United States and Europe will impose trade sanctions in those countries, and the financial markets will punish them for overriding the patent protection and hurt the rest of the economy. They can actually make a credible threat that if you don't pay their price for medicine, you won't be able to sell your crops. You won't be able to have jobs in the manufacturing sector. Your whole economy will suffer.
In the 90s, the Thai government was making a number of generic medicines, and they wanted to make generic AIDS drugs. DDI, a Bristol-Myers Squibb AIDS drug, was one of them. And the US government trade representatives threatened them with wood and jewelry export tariffs, basically saying, if you copy our patented medicines, we will slap tariffs on your wood and jewelry product exports to America. That represented 30% of Thailand's total exports. The Thai trade representatives were very frightened of that and stopped making these generic drugs.
This was not an isolated case. This year, a hard-fought change to WTO rules that would have allowed the poorest nations access to cheap generic drugs was agreed by every country in the world except the United States. President Bush, whose Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is a former Big Pharma chief executive, supported the drugs industry, and the US veto killed the agreement. In Korea, the licensing authority has met to discuss Mr. Nam's application for a compulsory license, but without Mr. Nam and behind closed doors. The day we filmed, the committee failed to reach a decision on a compulsory license for Glivec. But the continuing protests by patients did at least bring an invitation from Novartis to meet the leader of the patients' pressure group.
제가 전화한 적은 더 많고 그쪽에서 저한테 전화한 적이 많이 없기 때문에 그런 면에서 봤을 때 다른 때보다 좀 더 그 협상이 끝날 수 있는 기대감을 갖기에 충분하죠. 잘 될 수 있을